A ghost gun is, in fact, fully functional as a firearm. It can be made at home using do-it-yourself gun-making kits or a 3D printer. This frame, in a so-called jig, was made by a 3D printer. It can be made by anyone, drilling holes to make it functional, and then parts can be bought in a gun store or elsewhere. It becomes a firearm capable of killing, injuring, and doing as much damage as any firearm bought in a store, except it has no serial number, it is untraceable, and often undetectable. The kinds of kits that produce that firearm contain a, quote, unfinished frame or receiver, the key building block regulated under federal law and normally subject to background checks and serial number requirements. Unfinished is really a smokescreen. Ghost guns are intentionally designed, marketed, and sold to require as little technical expertise, time, and effort as possible to assemble. All one has to do is to finish this core part by drilling a few additional holes. Some sellers even supply the exact drill bits as part of their kit, alongside the rest of the components needed to make a functional firearm. It is purposefully that easy. Because the frames and receivers in these kits are, in quotes, unfinished, none of the normal federal gun laws apply. No background checks, no licensing, no serial numbers, nothing. And since these kits are unregulated, anyone can purchase them. Minors, convicted felons, anti-government extremists, violent white supremacists, foreign terrorists. Fair game for all of them. No checks, no regulation. They are, in fact, fast becoming the weapon of choice, costing as little as a few $100s and taking an hour to assemble with YouTube tutorials. The number of ghost guns is surging. The number seized, the number used in crimes, the number manufactured, all are skyrocketing. And at this rate, they will make a mockery of all other common sense gun safety steps. They will render meaningless background checks and other common sense regulation that now apply to make America safer. Last March, news outlets started reporting that the do-it-yourself ghost gun kits were, quote, flying off the shelves, and that manufacturers were, quote, reporting widespread back orders and shipping delays due to a pandemic buying surge, end quote. We have no really reliable metrics about these ghost guns because they have no serial numbers, they're unregulated, and there's no reliable count on how many are manufactured and sold. The most reliable metric we have concerning the number of ghost guns, in fact, in our communities is the number recovered by law enforcement. These numbers represent just a snapshot, but they are staggering, and the trend is alarming. Right here in D.C., ghost gun recoveries skyrocketed from 116 in 2019 to over 280 in 2020. And the story is the same in almost every other jurisdiction. We're going to hear more about that trend from Attorney General Shapiro and Commissioner Harrison in just a few minutes. Last May, 60 Minutes reported that at least 38 states and the District of Columbia have seen criminal cases involving ghost guns, including mass shootings, police shootouts, gang busts, terrorism, and white supremacist extremism. In Connecticut, police have recently seized ghost guns in narcotics investigation, traffic stops, and home invasions. In Hartford, in recent years, police have seized roughly 10 ghost guns per year, and just last fall, police arrested a suspect in possession of a ghost gun in connection with a shooting in East Hartford. Guns without a serial number recovered at the scene of a crime are untraceable. Without a serial number, law enforcement can't trace that gun to a seller or to a shooter. Ghost guns make criminal investigations difficult, and if there are no other leads, impossible to solve. As a result, those criminals are never apprehended, let alone prosecuted or convicted. One last staggering statistic. From January 1, 2016 through March 4, 2021, ATF attempted to trace 23,946 privately manufactured firearms, ghost guns. Out of those nearly 24,000 attempts, only 151 could be completed. That's less than 1%. That could mean, very simply, that 24,000 murders, assaults, armed robberies, and other crimes go unsolved. There is no reason, none, to treat ghost guns differently than any other gun. They look like a gun, they shoot like a gun, they kill like a gun. They should be treated as guns, and I invite both sides of the aisle, my colleagues on both sides, to support the Untraceable Firearms Act to close this loophole permanently, and I now turn to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses who are here today. Last Friday, the Biden administration published proposed regulations to significantly expand the regulation of firearms in this country. That proposed regulation and this hearing both focus on so-called ghost guns. It's a name that is intended to scare people. It's designed to make people think that certain firearms are more dangerous than others, that certain firearms are beyond the reach of current law. That's nonsense. It's simply not the case. The so-called ghost guns that we're talking about are nothing but homemade firearms. There's nothing special about them. There's nothing weird about them. But advocates of aggressive gun control rely on ignorance to scare people. Homemade firearms aren't any more dangerous than any other firearms. And for all relevant purposes, homemade firearms are treated like any other firearm under the law. If a person commits a crime with a homemade gun, they will be prosecuted just the same as anyone else. If a felon makes a homemade gun, he's a felon in possession of a firearm and will be prosecuted. If a person knowingly sells a homemade firearm to a criminal, that person has committed a crime and will be prosecuted. Chairman Blumenthal observed that, quote, "We have no reliable metric as to any connection between crime and homemade firearms." That's another way of saying there are zero data, no evidence whatsoever that this is contributing to crime at all. This is a made-up problem. And yet here we are having a congressional hearing pretending that so-called ghost guns are a major issue. They aren't. And I look forward to the next hearing of this subcommittee on Civil War replica cannons and how dangerous those are as well. If we want to have a hearing on gun violence, there are real topics to discuss. Gun violence and violent crime is a real problem in this country. It's not the made-up problem of ghost guns, but in 2020, gun violence soared to rates not seen in 20 years, with over 19,000 people killed by homicides and unintentional death, not including suicides. Time magazine reported that gun violence surged in the city of Chicago in 2020, with shooting incidents increasing by over 50% and homicides by 55% when compared to 2019. New York, the 2020 murder rates increased by 37.3%, and by 37.5% in Philadelphia, compared to 2019 rates. These cities, of course, all have things in common. They're all run entirely by Democrats. They all have strict gun control measures that criminals don't follow. Law-abiding citizens are disarmed, the criminals are not, and the deaths follows accordingly. And they're also all epicenters of the Democrats' radical push to defund the police. This committee has confirmed one senior official at the Department of Justice who's advocating defunding the police, and this committee is preparing to move forward on a second senior official at the Department of Justice who's advocating defunding the police. If Democrats want to stop gun violence, let's have a hearing on how the move to defund the police is causing more homicides. Let's have a hearing on how gun control proposals are making people more vulnerable to violent crime and how they failed the big city Democrat cities. That actually would be a hearing focused on crime and stopping it, and not instead a made-up topic of ghost guns. We already know that homemade guns are not a problem in terms of actually being involved in violent crime. When the Department of Justice surveyed criminals to ask how they obtain firearms used in crimes, not a single one appears to have said that he made his own weapon. Hear that again. The Department of Justice asked violent criminals, where'd you get their guns? 0 said it was a so-called ghost gun. 43% of criminals got their firearms from underground markets. 6% stole them, and 25% of them obtained them from an individual. So why are we talking about this made-up issue? It's simple. Democrats don't want to address the consistent, proven, empirical failure of gun control laws. They don't work, and they make crime worse. But they also want to scapegoat law-abiding citizens, the hobbyists who make homemade guns, who are not committing crimes. They want to scapegoat them. But the real issue is in something Chairman Blumenthal made several references to. He referred to these guns as untraceable. And that term was meant to be ominous. That's what this is all about. The Democrats on this committee want to trace every firearm in America. They want a registry of every firearm in America. They want a government list of what guns there are, who owns them, how many they own them, and inevitably, when you see countries enact registries of firearms, the next step is confiscation, and numerous Democrats on this committee have advocated for confiscating firearms. At home, Heidi and I own firearms. There is no government list of the firearms we own, and I'm very glad there's no government list of the firearms we own. We have an amendment in the Bill of Rights, the Second Amendment, that protects the right to keep and bear arms. This hearing is not about some real threat that's producing violent crime. There is 0 data to back up that this made-up phantom of ghost guns poses a real threat. Chairman Blumenthal wants to target violent crime. I would encourage him to join Senator Grassley and me in the Grassley-Cruz legislation that I introduced 9 years ago, targeting violent criminals, going after them, improving the background check system, improving the database, prosecuting felons and fugitives who lie trying to illegally buy a firearm. And I would note that when Grassley-Cruz was voted on the Senate floor in 2013 in a Democratic Senate, it got 52 votes on the Senate floor. It got 9 Democrats who voted in favor of it. The most bipartisan support of any of the comprehensive legislation. And the reason Grassley-Cruz didn't pass is Senate Democrats, including all 3 of the senators on the Democratic side of the aisle here today, voted against it and filibustered it, blocked real legislation targeting violent crime. Why? Because the objective instead is to target law-abiding citizens. That does nothing to stop crime, but it does a great deal to undermine our constitutional rights. I will note, finally, that as Chairman Blumenthal observed, there's a Rules Committee markup on legislation, S1 legislation many of us are referring to as the Corrupt Politicians Act. I'm going to spend the rest of the day in that Rules Committee markup, introducing and pressing a number of amendments. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to be here as ranking member. Senator Lee has very graciously agreed to participate in the hearing in my stead while I'm in the Rules Committee hearing. Thank you.
Before you leave, Senator Cruz, I might just take this occasion to correct a couple of the misrepresentations in what you just said. First of all, so far as I know, no member of this committee and members of the Senate on this side of the aisle are in favor of defunding the police. That is a massive distortion. Second, my comment about metrics was about sales. There are no reliable metrics on sales. There are clear metrics that link ghost guns to crime, and that is the point. On traceability, yes. You'll hear from law enforcement, or you would if you stayed, about the importance of tracing guns involved in crimes, in solving crimes, and putting criminals behind bars. Nobody on this committee, on this side of the aisle, wants to confiscate guns from law-abiding citizens. And as you well know, there happens to be an amendment in the Constitution that would, under the present Supreme Court interpretation, forbid it. I'm going to ask my Democratic colleague.
Senator Blumenthal, if I could briefly ask a question. You just said a moment ago that no Democrat favors abolishing the police. If that were the case, why did every single Democrat vote to confirm Vanita Gupta, a nominee for the number 3 position at the Department of Justice, who said last year in writing, in written testimony before this Senate, advocated abolishing the police? And she was confirmed by one vote. Every single Democrat was the necessary vote to confirm a radical who advocated abolishing the police. And just this week, we're taking up Kristen Clark, another radical who has last year in testimony before the Senate advocated abolishing the police. If you don't support abolishing the police, why do you keep voting for nominees who advocate abolishing the police?
As you well know, Senator Cruz, that is a complete distortion of their positions. We're not here to talk about those nominees. If you want to stay, we can do it at the end of the hearing, but right now we're going to move on. I turn to my Democratic colleagues if either of them have any opening statements. Senator Feinstein.
Senator Cruz, Mr. Chairman, asserts that ghost guns are not a problem. I'd like to disagree. They've been used in school and workplace shootings, to attack police officers, in mass shootings, including 3 in California. In 2013, Santa Monica shooter, opted to order parts to build his own gun after failing a background check. This is the kind of thing that happens. He went on to shoot over 100 rounds, killing 5 people and wounding several others. I just wanted to make that reference in response to the comments.
Thank you very much, Senator Feinstein. In deference to Senator Lee, who's taking over as ranking member, I would be perfectly happy to have an opening statement, and then we'll go to Senator Durbin.
Thanks so much, Mr. Chairman. Most Americans watching this hearing, if in fact there are any Americans watching this hearing, and why wouldn't they be interested in it, of course, but they might be wondering, what in the world are ghost guns? The phrase certainly does sound rather ominous. It sounds rather dangerous. I think it's intended to. Maybe like something straight out of a young person's video game. Ghost gun, it's a vague and intentionally scary sounding term that's been designed by gun control activists to describe a type of firearm, any firearm that has a common characteristic, that is, it doesn't have a serial number. This broad set of firearms might include antique firearms, or some curios or relics produced prior to 1968. It might also include arms manufactured at home or from a mail-in do-it-yourself kit, or lastly, it might include firearms whose serial numbers have been removed. Now, first, it's important to remember that it's a federal crime under 18 U.S.C. Section 922K to file off or otherwise remove or obliterate or alter a serial number, or to acquire a firearm that has had its serial number removed, obliterated, or altered. Most states have criminal statutes that are similar to 922K. Anti-gun activists would like for you to believe that making your own firearms is a new crazy trend, an emerging dangerous phenomenon. Those who might want you to believe this neglect, of course, to mention that the American tradition of privately made firearms started with the colonies and it continues today. In fact, the Continental Army relied very heavily on privately made firearms. And John Moses Browning of Ogden, Utah, who was known for revolutionizing the field of firearms, inventing rifles, pistols, and shotguns and machine guns. Browning invented and made all of these firearms privately, only later selling the patents to companies like Winchester. Privately made firearms are part of our American story, a story of hard work, of innovation, and of ingenuity. These anti-gun activists would like you to believe that privately made firearms pose a new danger to society. They use misleading statistics to make it sound as if privately made firearms are commonly used to commit violent crimes. For example, the ATF's notice of proposed rulemaking says, quote, from January 2016 through December 31st, 2020, there were approximately 23,906 suspected PMFs, or privately made firearms, reported to ATF as having been recovered by law enforcement from potential crime scenes, close quote. But these crime scenes, of these crime scenes, where privately made firearms were recovered, only 325, or 1%, involved homicides or attempted homicides. So it's important to look at what the numbers actually say rather than what one might glean from them at a distance. Now let's look at how one should analyze the Biden administration's proposed rule on privately made firearms. The Second Amendment to the Constitution protects Americans' right to keep and bear arms. When analyzing any gun control proposal, I look at the likely impact it will have on the constitutional rights of law-abiding Americans, those who build their own firearms as a hobby or for marksman competitions or to make better, safer firearms, perhaps for their own use. Not to mention that the Biden administration is attempting to change the law through rulemaking instead of through coming to Congress. I'm convinced that proposals like the proposed rule the Biden administration issued on Friday will most certainly affect those law-abiding Americans who use 80% lower receivers or receiver blanks while doing very little to stop criminals who want to use guns in order to hurt other people. This proposed rule will also get us one step closer to firearm registry, one of the top goals of many who are part of the anti-gun left. So these are concerns. I think they're real concerns. They're legitimate concerns. And I think we've got to be careful with the terminology that we use. Just as importantly, we've got to look out for the interests of the law-abiding. And it's those people, the law-abiding Americans, whose rights are very often eroded whenever government steps into this area. Thank you.
Senator Durbin.
Senator Blumenthal, perhaps someone, a historian, maybe one of our witnesses, will tell us when we decided to create the federal law that Senator Lee related to, when we decided that protecting the existence of a serial number on a firearm was important to our government. I assume that decision was made in the hopes that we would reduce violent crime and the misuse of firearms. And then the obvious question, well, if it's already the law, why are we here today? And that really gets to the heart of the issue, because that statute applies to finished firearms. And up until recent times, that was usually the case. When people were purchasing a firearm, it was a finished product. And there was a federal law which required a serial number. Well, we live in a brand new world now. And over the internet, you can buy these so-called kits to make your own gun, so-called ghost guns, and avoid the very statute you've quoted. So that's what the Blumenthal bill is all about, closing a loophole in the law which allows anyone to avoid the necessity of having a serial number on a firearm. Isn't that what it gets down to? Isn't that basic? And Senator Cruz before you was mocking the use of the term ghost gun and went so far at one point, I don't want to misstate what he said, but I got the impression this just isn't happening. People aren't using ghost guns in crime. Hang on tight, Senator. I'm sorry Senator Cruz has a conflict in another committee. Hang on tight when you listen to the witnesses here. They're going to give you chapter and verse of cities and counties across the United States where these ghost guns, without serial numbers, untraceable, are being confiscated in the commission of crime, deadly, violent crime. Senator Cruz was suggesting this is some sort of folly by Senator Blumenthal. It is not. It is a matter of life and death. And I think it's not too much to ask that even for the hobbyist, whatever they're purchasing, have a serial number and comply with the federal law. That's what this is all about. And I'm glad we're having this hearing. Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. And the notion that we would have a proliferation of homemade guns, untraceable homemade guns, and that is in the best interest of our nation, I beg to differ. Saying to people who misuse firearms, we're not going to give you another avenue, another option to create a gun with no serial number and go out and kill someone with it. We're going to make it more difficult. And I think most Americans would agree with that.
Thanks, Senator Urban. And as chairman of the committee, thank you for permitting and encouraging this subcommittee hearing today and for your championing gun safety measures along with Senator Feinstein. You've been real champions. I'm going to introduce the witnesses. We have a very, very expert panel. First, Attorney General Josh Shapiro. He has served as Pennsylvania's Attorney General since 2017. As Attorney General, he is tackling the scourge of gun violence across Pennsylvania, and he's committed to improving trust in the justice system. He's directing an urgent across-the-board fight against the big drug companies, trafficking rings that fuel the heroin and opioid epidemic. Currently in his second term, Attorney General Shapiro has taken on the climate crisis, defended voting rights, and protected women's access to contraception. Ms. Ashley Hlebinsky is Curator Emerita and Senior Firearms Scholar for the Cody Firearms Museum in Cody, Wyoming. She earned her master's degree in American history from the University of Delaware. She has researched and worked in several nationally recognized firearms collections, including the Smithsonian Institution's National Firearms Collection. We're joined remotely by Commissioner Michael Harrison. He has served as the 41st Commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department since 2019. He previously served as the New Orleans Police Department for nearly 3 decades. Commissioner Harrison also serves as president of the Police Executive Research Forum and as a member of the Major Cities Chiefs Association, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. Mr. Rick Vasquez, he is a United States government certified firearms classification expert. He's represented the United States as a firearms technical representative to aid other nations, and he has worked with the federal government in firearms policies and questions. He's also recognized in state and federal court as a firearms and ammunition classification expert. Nick Suplina serves as managing director for law and policy at Everytown for gun safety. With more than 20 years of legal and policy experience, he oversees the organizational strategy for federal, state, and local police research and investigation for that organization. Prior to joining Everytown, Mr. Suplina was senior advisor and special counsel to the New York State Attorney General, where he was cross-designated to the New York Organized Crime Task Force for his work on combating untraceable ghost guns. We thank you all for being here today, and I'm going to ask our witnesses to please stand and be sworn, as is the custom of this committee. You solemnly affirm that the testimony you will give today is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Thank you. We'll begin with Attorney General Shapiro.
Acting Ranking Member Lee and members of this committee, I'm Josh Shapiro. I've served as Pennsylvania's Attorney General, as the chairman noted, for the last 4.5 years. And I'm very thankful that this subcommittee is taking ghost guns, the emerging weapon of choice for violent criminals, quite seriously, and has given all of us time today to inform this committee and assist you in better understanding this issue, and perhaps even we can take some time to correct many of the outlandish misstatements from the ranking member that were stated before. I would note that just because something is said with passion does not make it true. My office has been working on the real threat of ghost guns since 2017. These are untrackable, untraceable firearms built at home or sometimes on gun show tables. They lack serial numbers, and they are purchased, importantly, without a background check. With me today, I have a polymer 80 jig of a 9mm Glock-style handgun. This jig comes in a kit with an 80% receiver, the drill bits necessary, the trigger assembly, and all of the components to make a fully operational firearm. It's quickly assembled by drilling 3 holes, here, here, and here, and then milling out 3 pieces, here, here, and here. Unlike the collectibles or hobby build-at-home gun kits of years ago, these kits can be assembled in minutes using very simple tools. Let me give you some data points from the real world of what we are seeing in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. In 2018 in Philadelphia, just 13 ghost guns were recovered. In 2019, that increased nearly 8-fold to 99 ghost guns. In 2020, that number more than doubled again to 250, and today we've recovered 201 of these ghost guns in just the first 4 months of the year. That's in one city alone. Across all of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we've seen an exponential increase in recoveries by 437%. That's data, that is facts, that's what we're seeing on the ground. The consequences are heartbreaking. Last March, a former Temple University football player was killed on the streets of Chinatown in Philadelphia with a ghost gun, fired by someone, and this is important, who would not have passed a background check, yet still got their hands on one of these. Over the past 3 years, agents from my office have witnessed felons and people prohibited from purchasing firearms buy these ghost gun kits with cash and leave gun shows with them by the duffel bag size full. They walk out of a gun show, assemble the kits in minutes, and send fully functioning guns onto our streets and right in the hands of violent criminals. We've made arrests where ghost guns purchased at gun shows are on the streets literally the next day after that purchase. In 2019, our agents witnessed prohibited purchasers buying an 80% receiver kit just like this one at a York gun show. They took it to the next table over, just feet away as I am from these witnesses here, where a convicted felon and neo-Nazi drilled out the receiver, assembled the gun, and handed it back to him right at the gun show. Last year, our agents watched as a company sold 90 of these kits in one batch to a convicted felon, paying $38,000 in cash. When our office executed a search warrant at this individual's home, it turned up even more fully assembled firearms made with these kits. There were loads of ammunition, cash, and a setup to churn out these guns. Had we not had agents at that show, dozens more ghost guns would be on the streets of Pennsylvania today. Earlier this year, we arrested a man in Philadelphia who was buying these kits at a gun show, then selling the assembled weapons on the streets for $1,100. That's a 100% profit. Last month, we recovered 6 ghost guns in Pennsylvania's Lehigh Valley during the course of a drug trafficking investigation, along with 6 ghost guns, $1 million of meth, and Nazi paraphernalia. While my office has made great strides and experienced success operationally in getting these firearms off the street, law enforcement cannot keep up with the supply. So we've had to work smarter and create meaningful partnerships like the one with Pennsylvania's largest gun show promoter to voluntarily remove all of these DIY kits from their shows. At the time of the agreement, the dealers had already sold 6,000 of these ghost guns. And as a result of this first of its kind in the nation agreement, we were able to stop 36,000 of these guns from getting out on the street. I'm here today to respectfully urge the Senate to seize this opportunity where law enforcement, community groups, and gun owners and gun shops agree that we have to do more, that we have to make sure these DIY kits require a background check so we can simply keep them out of the hands of criminals. Mr. Chairman, this is common sense. We know these kits can be fully functioning firearms in minutes. We know they're being used to kill people on the streets of our communities. And this body has the power to do something about it. Look, I recognize there is a lot of expertise at this table and in this room. It's on us to figure out a way to protect law-abiding gun owners, to preserve our heritage and not burden hobbyists, while still closing off violent criminals' easy access to these unserialized, untraceable guns that do not require a background check. Thank you all very much for having this hearing, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks very much, Attorney General Shapiro. Ms. Hlebinsky.
There we go. Chairman Blumenthal, Sub-Ranking Member Lee, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Ashley Hlebinsky, and I am honored to testify today about the long history of privately made firearms in American culture. But first, I do want to address the terminology that I will be using and why. Firstly, I will not be using the term ghost gun, and that's because as a historian, I try to be as precise as possible, and the term is used more as a rhetorical tool, a marketing tool, and because of that, it can create a false sense of authority on the subject rather than describe the actual technology that we are talking about. For example, it is conceivable that when hearing the term, the average person could conflate the terms undetectable and untraceable. What I mean by that is, if you hear the term ghost gun, you could assume that it is invisible, and by that term, maybe it bypasses a security scanner. Instead, this term recognizes and references a lack of tracing tools that are sometimes used by law enforcement after a crime is committed. So for clarity, I will be using the terms such as home-built and privately made firearms. Please note, though, that I am using the term firearm as a historical definition rather than a legal one. Now let's shift to the historical background on these firearms. Now, trust me, there's a lot of history here, so please refer to my written testimony if you would like more specifics, and I'm happy to go into these details further if and when there is more time. But essentially, the big takeaway about the history is that these privately made firearms have been around for centuries, basically since the first ignition system was developed over 500 years ago. And throughout these times, these gun makers have been essential to both the civilian and government. It may surprise you that the term discussed a lot today, parts kits, have been used regularly dating back to the 1700s. Private gun makers in America could order locks and barrels from overseas in order to expedite the process when building guns. It's also important to note that these too involved filing processes and a lot of other modifications, as some parts kits are today. The other thing is, when armories became available, or people that were making government firearms, the individual and the private gun maker was still incredibly important. In the American Revolution, the British had an armory and they still bought lock plates from civilians. And the U.S. government actually sought to design a standard pattern to simplify this process for individual gun makers. Even as modern manufacturing processes and major companies appeared in the 19th century, the government and commercial markets still relied on individual designers to innovate and create firearms that these companies would in turn purchase and produce. And as already said, these were mainly any firearm that you could do. And they were unencumbered by these regulations and laws that we're discussing today because they weren't considered a threat to public safety. And in this way, these regulations, is what we're talking about today, could influence innovation. And now I know a lot of people here don't necessarily like some of the technology that exists today, but I really want to make the point that innovation also means making firearms safer. On May 7th, the ATF released a proposal in which they recommended several modifications to these definitions. Unfortunately, many of those rationales are not historically accurate. For example, the terms striker fire and split receivers are two technologies that were claimed not to be readily available at the time these definitions were made. However, striker fire guns, which are historically and mechanically known as linear hammers, have been prevalent, as have the term split receiver, since the late 1800s and early 1900s. These things have remained unregulated within the terms that we're talking about today. So the question is, why change that? Striker fire and split receivers do not make a firearm more or less lethal than the firearms that are available on the market today. Because this terminology is flawed and inaccurate, this is misleading. And these policies and proposed changes can have unintended consequences for everyone. And it's interesting and important to understand that these things can affect both sides, criminalizing those who would otherwise be considered innocent, but also opening the door for loopholes and litigation, and worst of all, continued violence. The complicated and confusing nature of all of these terms also neuter the potential efficacy of the laws. And if the goal is to save lives and the law fails to accomplish what you claim it will, you're not only letting your constituency down, but you're also leaving them vulnerable to a false sense of security, something nobody here wants on either side.
Thank you. Commissioner Michael Harrison joining us remotely.
Chairman Blumenthal, ranking member, distinguished members of the Judiciary Committee, thank you for holding this important hearing today about ghost guns. I'm honored, to appear before you today, and I'm joined by Lieutenant Colonel John Herzog, who is my Deputy Chief of Investigations in the Baltimore Police Department. Now, as the Commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department, I lead one of the nation's largest police forces with nearly 3,000 sworn officers and civilian personnel. I became the commissioner of the BPD in 2019 after almost 3 decades in New Orleans in that police department, which I had the honor of leading as its superintendent for 4.5 years. Now, when I accepted the job in Baltimore, I knew the challenges facing the city were many, especially when it comes to reducing the unacceptable rates of gun violence. For far too long, Baltimore's residents have borne the devastating impact of this violence. However, the data shows that the vast majority of guns used in these violent crimes are illegally trafficked. In fact, last year alone, more than 82% of guns recovered in Baltimore came from outside of the city, and nearly 65% of those guns were purchased outside of the state of Maryland. In Baltimore, we're working every day to break the cycle of gun violence with evidence-based solutions and community policing initiatives. But we face a new threat to public safety from unserialized firearms known as ghost guns. In February of 2021, members from our Southwestern District Action Team were patrolling an area notorious for violence and drug activity. At the very sight of a police vehicle, a male suspect began fleeing on foot while holding his front waistband, heightening concerns that he was armed. As he ran away, the individual was seen discarding vials of suspected cocaine. Now, police apprehended the suspect and recovered a 9mm polymer 80 handgun with no serial number, which was loaded with 26 rounds of ammunition. The suspect was only 17 years old, too young to purchase or possess a firearm in Maryland. And because the gun was unserialized, it was a dead end for law enforcement when it came to tracing it. Last year, Baltimore had a 300% increase in the number of ghost guns that have been seized in our city. Of those seizures, Baltimore police linked 15 of those ghost guns to a shooting or a homicide. The Southwestern District, which experiences the most gun crimes and homicides in the city, also had the highest number of ghost guns seized. And most disturbingly, nearly 1/4 of all of the ghost guns recovered by the Baltimore police were from individuals who were not old enough to obtain a firearm, including an individual who was only 14 years old. Unfortunately, this trend has continued into the current calendar year with no signs of letting up. So far in 2020, we've recovered 83 privately made firearms, which means we are far outpacing last year. At this rate, we are on pace to seize upwards of 300 ghost guns, and this will be in the range of 10 to 15% of all guns recovered this year in the city. As alarming as these statistics are, this growing problem is not unique to Baltimore. Cities from New York to Los Angeles are experiencing a similar explosion of ghost guns, and due to the lack of regulation, they've quickly become a weapon of choice for traffickers and criminals. And unless action is taken, I only expect this problem to get worse. Let me explain why. A ghost gun is easy to obtain. Gun traffickers no longer need to work with unscrupulous dealers or gun shows. A criminal can go online and purchase the parts to create a fully functional firearm with only a few clicks of a mouse. Then a ghost gun is untraceable. For criminals and those involved in illicit activity, a ghost gun is attractive because it's difficult, if not impossible, to trace when used in crime. A ghost gun is anonymous because the ghost gun parts are not currently regulated as guns. Individuals are not required to undergo a background check when purchasing them. That means people who are prohibited from purchasing a weapon, for example, a convicted felon or a convicted abuser, for example, can become armed by assembling a ghost gun. And then a ghost gun is deadly. Just like any firearm made by a licensed manufacturer, ghost guns are fully functional, just as lethal. And if criminals are turning to ghost guns, what does it mean for law enforcement officers in Baltimore and in other communities? Simply put, ghost guns add a new level of danger to our work, and when criminal elements can evade a background check with a ghost gun, law enforcement loses the ability to keep firearms out of the hands of dangerous individuals. When we can't trace recovered crime guns, there's no way to identify trafficking patterns. It makes our job much more difficult and puts lives at risk. Last week, the DOJ issued a new proposed regulation that would bring ghost guns in line with our federal firearms laws. This action is critical and needed. Most importantly, it will save lives. Now, as we applaud the Biden administration for taking action, I hope that Congress won't lose sight of the need to help Baltimore and other cities that are struggling with daily gun violence. Passing gun safety legislation must be a priority to protect the public and provide federal support so communities can interrupt violence before it becomes deadly. I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify in this important hearing and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Commissioner. Now remotely turn to Rick Vasquez.
Senator Cruz and Senator Blumenthal for allowing me to come to this hearing today and express my informed opinions. My name is Richard Rick Vasquez, and it's a privilege to provide testimony today on proposed regulations and statutes pertaining to homemade firearms. I am very familiar with the issue of homemade firearms and the regulations pertaining to them. As a firearms consultant, I frequently represent the firearms industry and clients that are currently in the business of making ATF-approved non-firearms, non-weapons that are molded from plastic or cut from aluminum billets. It's from this experience that I say that I'm very concerned about ATF change definitions and regulations will affect this industry. My background in a quick synopsis is a 21-year career in the Marine Corps. During that time, I served at Desert Storm and as a detachment commander on embassy duty in Moscow, Russia, which is the pinnacle of embassy duty. I also served as chief instructor of the Marines Precision Weapons Shop and was responsible for introducing the Baird 50 caliber sniper rifle to Marine snipers during Desert Storm. After the USMC, I worked as a firearms instructor trainer for Diplomatic Security Service. I was later employed by ATF, where I worked as a firearms technology expert until I retired. While I was employed by ATF, I wrote the first formal standard operating procedures for the technology branch. I traveled on numerous occasions through Mexico, Central America, Haiti, France, Canada, Australia, and numerous U.S. states where I provided training on firearms identification and trafficking. During these training events, we instructed tracing, and I physically traced thousands of firearms. As a firearms technology expert, I was the first person to bring homemade firearms and 3D printing to the attention of ATF leadership. This is not a new issue. However, it is being used as an attention getter to give the ATF an opportunity to change regulations. I assisted in developing the Advanced Firearms Identification Training for ATF's Industry Operations Investigators, and while assigned to Firearms Operations Division, I was the technical expert that provided the expertise on a training program that provided knowledge on parts kits guns to all of ATF in 2013. I have read the proposed rulemaking, and I am concerned that these regulations do substantially more harm than good and do little to nothing to stop crime. From my experience, most people who are putting homemade firearms into illegal commerce are convicted felons or persons that are criminals, and these new laws will not hinder them. It will only hinder law-abiding citizens who will respond to the changed law. I believe there will be little to no effect on reducing crime by regulating these homemade firearms. If we want to stop crime, lawmakers and enforcers should be going after firearms traffickers, the criminals that have guns and sell them to other criminals, not law-abiding citizens who choose to manufacture them at home. We should spend more time and attention writing anti-trafficking laws and providing enhanced firearms training to our law enforcement personnel, not regulating a lawful business. Moreover, we need to acknowledge that completing a firearm for personal use is not cost-effective and is not as simple as it appears. These non-firearms castings and moldings have been properly classified by ATF and should not change. The primary effect of the new rule or other potential regulations treating these molds as firearms will be the removing of a hobby from law-abiding citizens. It appears that the main goal of this regulation and of lawmakers interested in this space is the application of a serial number to homemade firearms. In my opinion, this is not only unnecessary, it is the beginning of a form of registration. In addition, the effect of the new rule on the firearms industry will be economically devastating. These are persons that have found a niche industry without having to be licensed. The new regulations will force them to be licensed, which will take away the market of law-abiding citizens making their own firearms. Finally, the trace data on quantity of homemade firearms traced on the proposed rulemaking is not supported by ATF's annual trace data. The number of homemade firearms traced on the proposed rulemaking is much higher than the number of firearms traced on the 2019 annual trace report. In conclusion, I'm here to provide testimony on homemade firearms and the effect it will have on the firearms industry and the lawful gun owner. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Vasquez. Our last witness is Nick Suplina, who joins us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Blumenthal, Ranking Member, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Nick Suplina. I am the Managing Director for Law and Policy at Everytown for Gun Safety. We're the nation's largest gun violence prevention organization. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'm grateful for your attention to this important public safety issue. Ghost guns are unserialized homemade firearms that can be quickly assembled and acquired without a background check. They include firearms with core parts made using 3D printers, milled with the assistance of a computer code, or simply drilled with aid of a jig kit. I first learned of ghost guns prior to joining Everytown when I was special counsel in the New York Attorney General's office. In spring of 2015, I received a phone call from the head of the New York State Organized Crime Task Force. And she was calling because the New York State Police discovered that an individual who was currently in jail on firearms charges had boasted about a plan upon his release to order gun parts online and make money selling untraceable firearms. She asked me, how was this possible? We soon found out that the answer was ghost guns, an end run around the law that allowed this convicted weapons offender and his co-conspirators to order parts online and quickly build a dozen untraceable tactical assault weapons and sell them to a person he thought was a gun trafficker. Thankfully, that person was an undercover officer whose work led to 3 arrests and subsequent convictions in the crime. We think the first state prosecution of ghost guns trafficking in the country. Now, it's been less than 6 years since that prosecution, but in that short time, we've learned a lot about the rise of untraceable ghost guns and how they have become the fastest growing threat to gun safety in the country. First, we've learned that the market for ghost guns exploded because ATF changed its approach to unfinished frames and receivers, the core building blocks of ghost guns. And this is important. Back in the 1970s and 80s, ATF correctly determined that unfinished frames and receivers were firearms subject to the 1968 Act, so long as they could be, quote, converted to functional condition within a few hours using common hand tools or simple grinding, cutting, drilling, or welding operations. But in the mid-2000s and without explanation, ATF changed course, and the market for ghost guns grew, as did the technology for these firearms advanced. There are now at least 100 online sellers offering unfinished frames or receivers for ghost guns, and these parts are routinely sold at gun shows. Second, we've learned that the criminals and gun traffickers are taking advantage of this growing ghost guns marketplace. Ghost guns are now turning up at crime scenes from coast to coast, and the numbers are shocking. ATF recently reported that over a 4-year period, nearly 24,000 homemade firearms were recovered in crimes. And many cities are seeing ghost gun recoveries doubling year over year, as you've already heard this morning. The simple fact is that the word is out among criminals that ghost guns are an easy way around our gun laws, and in particular, a way around background checks. Finally, we've learned that ghost guns are rapidly becoming the weapon of choice for armed extremists. The House Committee on Homeland Security has concluded that ghost guns are a threat to our national security, and we have found numerous examples of white supremacist and anti-government extremist groups building ghost guns and using them with deadly intention and effect. Among the examples, in California, a man associated with the right-wing anti-government Boogaloo movement viewed a Black Lives Matter protest as an opportunity to accelerate civil war, a civil war he believed was inevitable. Using a ghost gun, he attacked a federal courthouse during a racial justice protest in Oakland, killing one federal officer and later killing a Santa Cruz sheriff's deputy before being apprehended. In Delaware, members of the white supremacist terror group known as The Base plan to ignite a race war using ghost guns and other weapons. Their target, a Virginia gun rights rally. Luckily, the FBI intercepted the group just days before that event. Authorities discovered a treasure trove of homemade firearms and a lengthy internet search history about how to make ghost guns. In fact, our online investigation has shown that extremists discuss the benefit of ghost guns and share advice on how to make them. For example, on 4chan, an online platform popular with white supremacists, commenters have shared tips for building ghost guns amid a steady stream of racist, anti-Semitic, and homophobic slurs. So amid such a clear and expanding threat, we need action. We applaud the Department of Justice and the Biden administration for proposing concrete solutions to address this issue. We also hope that Congress will advance legislation to tackle the threat posed by all types of ghost guns, including the files that facilitate creation of downloadable guns and plastic firearms. Again, thank you for the opportunity to testify before the subcommittee. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Suplina. We'll have rounds of 5-minute questioning. We have a vote at 11:30, but I think we can go for a while. Let me ask you, Attorney General Shapiro, you just heard Mr. Vasquez say that you ought to be focusing on gun trafficking. Mm-hmm. Do ghost guns impede your ability to go after gun traffickers?
Not at all, Mr. Chairman. We can walk and chew gum at the same time in Pennsylvania, and we do just that. We have special units in my office dedicated to gun trafficking. I formed a special alliance, for example, with New Jersey Attorney General Gurbir Grewal, and we launched an initiative to focus on gun trafficking between predominantly Camden and Philadelphia, where we recently had an Operation Zombie, which netted us more than 26 guns and shut down a gun trafficking ring there as well. We can do both. We're also finding the gun traffickers are trafficking in these ghost guns. And remember, typically, if you're a criminal and you are in need of getting a gun, you either need to rely on a gun trafficking network or rely on a straw purchaser to go in for you. Utilizing these ghost guns, which do not require a background check, you take the straw and the gun trafficker out of that equation, and the criminal can now buy the gun directly. So we can do all of the above, but we can't ignore ghost guns, which are a massive threat in our communities today.
You showed us the jig, which is, in a sense, the container that is used to make the frame by drilling holes that are pre-marked. Would you say there is any particular artistry or craftsmanship involved in making one of these frames using a pre-made kit of this kind?
No artistry, no craftsmanship, and Senator, very little skill is required. Let me tell you how it really works. You go to the gun show, you go over to table A, and you buy this. You then go over to table B, you get the other parts. And by the way, table B is this far away. And as I talked about in the example of the York County gun show, they'll assemble it for you right there. In fact, they had a criminal who was a white supremacist doing the work for you right there. So either they can do it for you there, or you could take it home, as was the example I used from Philadelphia, where they were buying them by the duffel bag load and assembling them there and then selling them for more than a 100% profit on the streets. I could have one of these put together within 20 minutes, and Senator, as my wife and kids will tell you, I'm not particularly handy. So if I can do it in 20, someone who's handy can do it in even less.
Mr. Suplina, you made reference to the prevalence of white supremacists, violent extremists making use of these ghost guns particularly. Why is that?
Well, Senator, these guns are optimal for those groups. They appeal to these groups precisely because they are an end run around our federal and state laws. So if you are trying to stay off the grid, if you are trying to amass an arsenal without even your local gun dealer getting wise to it, ghost guns are a perfect way of doing that. And then when you use those firearms in crimes or terrorist acts, they're untraceable, back to you or your group.
And I think you testified also about 3D printed guns. This is a new technology, spreading, more prevalent, and we should make clear that the proponents of these guns make the contention that they are harmless, they're hobbyists, but in fact, this kind of exception can swallow the rule involving background checks and all the other gun safety protections that we have. What is this 3D technology?
So 3D tech, and first let me just say, Senator, that the term ghost gun, which would apply to 3D printed guns or these unfinished frames and receivers, not a term that I made up. You can go to ghostguns.com or buy the Ghost Gunner. These are marketed this way precisely to people who are trying to avoid regulation. But 3D printed guns, just like other forms of ghost guns, take all the artistry, all of the skills out of it. With 3D guns, if you have a master file that's essentially the blueprints of the firearm, and you have the appropriate 3D printer, you can print either all or part of a firearm. It is newer technology. It is less available to the end user, but it is there, and we are seeing fully operational firearms printed either in plastic or in aluminum.
My last question on this round is to Commissioner Harrison. Commissioner Harrison, what kinds of crimes have you found that these ghost guns are involved in?
Thank you. We're finding that, first of all, there are a large number of people who are illegally carrying them on the street, transporting them in vehicles. But we are seeing a percentage of homicides and shootings being committed with polymer 80s. And so, for example, in 2020, 15 ghost guns were directly linked to a homicide or shooting, while in 2021, 15 were linked through ballistics to another gun crime, and 17 have been linked to violence. This year, we're seeing an exponential increase in the amount of ghost guns we are recovering. 83 so far. The majority of them are being transported around the city in vehicles, and they're being used to commit shootings and homicides. And we're seeing a large number of people under the age of 21 and a large number of people who are prohibited by law from possessing a firearm. are purchasing the firearm, found in possession of them, and are using them in those homicides and shootings. Some of them are being left at the scene.
Thank you, Commissioner. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Vasquez, I'd like to start with you. Thanks for your service to our country, and thanks for your willingness to testify in front of our committee today. There are a number of people, including you, who have raised concerns that this proposed rule could be the beginning of a national firearm registry. Could you explain why?
Yes, sir, and thank you for that question, and I'd like to expand on that somewhat. One of the things said earlier was that citizens were required to serialize firearms since the beginning of the Gun Control Act, and that's incorrect. 923I under the Gun Control Act specifies that only licensed manufacturers and licensed importers are required to put a serial number on them so that an individual could still manufacture or build his own firearm without having to put required markings on it. And as far as turning this into a registration, I know the burdens that has already been put on gunsmiths. There's a fine line between what is a gunsmith and what is a manufacturer. And the proposal was to have ATF, the ATF proposed was to give gunsmiths the ability to put serial numbers on homemade firearms for people who wanted to make their homemade firearm. And then they would mark these with a portion of their license and an annotated serial number. I could see in a very short period of time where ATF or Department of Justice would be contacting these gun dealers by their license number and asking them to produce the amount of firearms that they serialize for individuals on a daily or weekly basis. And then it comes, and like I said, when it comes to the point is, if I make my own firearm, I'm not required to serialize it. So why should I put a serial number and give it up to somebody else and have them put it in some type of registry? And that's what it becomes.
Now, to be clear, most firearms that are used to commit crimes are obtained illegally in order to circumvent the NICS background check system. So in many cases, they're stolen, or they're bought by straw purchasers, or they're purchased on the black market. All of these things are illegal under current law. Now, in light of this, how will serializing 80% lowers and requiring a NICS check on law-abiding Americans who purchase them, how will that make us safer?
Senator Lee, that is a great comment, because criminals do not fill out 4473s today, and they do not do NICS checks. So they will continually look for a loophole to find an illegal firearm. They are not buying firearms the way you or I would, and there will never be a shortage of firearms for criminals. As I said, I've traveled all over Central America and Mexico on behalf of ATF, and there was no shortage of foreign-made firearms. When they run out of firearms that they can attain in the United States, they will find other markets. Then it'll really get bad when they start bringing in these military-grade firearms made in China, Russia, Yugoslavia, and other countries, because criminals will always get the firearms they need to run their cartel organization.
Right. Ms. Hlebinsky, as you mentioned in your testimony, there were over 112,000 attempted straw purchases in 2017, including the San Bernardino shooters who enlisted a neighbor to purchase on their behalf. How many people were prosecuted for attempted straw purchases in 2017?
According to my documents,
12. 12 out of those 112,000.
Correct.
So they don't go after very many of those who do it. And so if they're not even doing that, it begs the question, why do we need more laws in order to cover what's mostly being done only by the law-abiding and would be more likely to be done only by the law-abiding here?
You were correct with that assertion. We all know that there are already laws on the books that are not being enforced, but this is also another issue because the terminology that's used in most of these laws that go around firearms parts and features, which is really something that is a 20th century phenomenon in gun laws, the wording ends up being so confusing, convoluted, that it ultimately opens us up to not really be doing what everyone's saying that it's doing. It basically waters it down and isn't accomplishing the goal that people who believe in a certain pro-gun control claim that it is.
Right. These do raise significant concerns, and the Second Amendment, which we've had in place since 1791, itself has roots in English legal history stretching back hundreds of years before that. We've got to be very careful before we tinker with that right, especially when we have to take into account what any proposed change in the law will do to the law abiding and what that would even gain us. Separate and apart from the constitutional questions, it's imperative as part of the analysis to look into what this is going to do who are already abiding by the law, and what, if anything, will a change to the law do to deter actual violent criminal behavior. I see my time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Lee. Senator Feinstein.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think the reason that we're here, if we go back to 2018, the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the major city chiefs named ghost guns, quote, a public security threat, and called on lawmakers to take action. Now, the interesting thing is, since that time, the problem has gotten worse. A special agent from ATF's Los Angeles Field Division reported that 41% of their cases last year involved a ghost gun. 41% of their cases. So, Commissioner Harrison, let me ask you, do you believe that the rise in ghost guns puts law enforcement at a greater risk?
Thank you, ma'am. I absolutely believe that it puts us at a greater risk. As we've seen an exponential increase, when you look at 2019, we only recovered 29, but in 2020, we've recovered 126. 2021, we've already recovered 83, and we have percentages of those guns used in violent crimes like murders and non-fatal shootings because they can't be traced. On the streets of America. And it puts us at greater risk because we lose the ability to track down who uses the gun, where they got it from, or all the way back to its origin, to be able to know why and how a person obtained that gun and hold people accountable, not just the person pulling the trigger, but the person who obtained the gun for the sole purpose of passing it on to someone to use it in a violent crime.
Thank you.
That person is just as guilty, and it makes us exponentially more in danger.
Thank you. Attorney General Shapiro, how has the rise in ghost guns affected law enforcement in Pennsylvania?
Well, Senator, as I mentioned in my comments earlier, we've seen a dramatic increase just over the last few years in the presence of ghost guns all across Pennsylvania. In the last year, we've seen a 437% increase in the number of ghost guns that we've recovered. And those are just what law enforcement has recovered. Senator Lee, in his questioning, talked about that balance between protecting liberty, I'm paraphrasing, sir, protecting liberty and protecting public safety and keeping these out of the hands of criminals. It is clear to me that this is a glaring loophole that criminals are taking advantage of by being able to ignore the straw purchaser, not have to engage with the gun traffickers, simply walk into a gun show, where at one table they would fail a background check if they bought the fully assembled firearm, but instead they walk over to the next table, buy one of these, no background check, and they're on their way. Or they buy it from someone who purchased it at the gun show. This is the weapon of choice for criminals. This is what we're up against in the real world. This is what's killing people. And all I'm simply here saying is, let's require people to have a background check. Let's make sure that criminals can't just simply walk into a gun show, or go online and buy one of these when they otherwise would not be able to buy a gun. That's what we're up against. This is a real threat. This is a serious issue, and it is taking lives in our communities.
Thank you. You've made the case cogently. It's appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Feinstein. I understand that Senator Whitehouse is on remotely.
I am.
Thank you, Senator Whitehouse.
And I'm, there we go. Delighted to join you all. Thank you so much. In Cranston, Rhode Island, the police chief is a wonderful guy named Michael Winquist. And Michael tells me that untraceable firearms, referred to as ghost guns, have become the weapon of choice for individuals involved in drug dealing and other criminal activity. Commissioner Harrison, is that what you are seeing in Baltimore and hearing from others in law enforcement?
Yes, sir, it is. Not just used by drug traffickers and people on the street selling drugs, but they are by many people just carrying them on the streets of Baltimore, transporting them in vehicles, and we are seeing them being used in non-fatal shootings and homicides. Perpetrators are sometimes leaving them at the scene. Sometimes some of our victims are in possession of some of them, but we are seeing an exponential increase year to year, starting in 2019 through 2020, now in 2021, of people choosing the polymer handguns or the privately owned made or ghost guns as the weapon of choice. More and more of these are being seen and confiscated. While we're still confiscating regular and traditional firearms, this number is exponentially increasing really fast.
And again, in Rhode Island, we had a ghost gun trafficker who pled guilty after selling to an ATF agent an M16 machine gun receiver that he built for $2,800 was the fee. And he had promised to build more guns and to do more business. To what extent, I guess, Mr. Suplina, do you see this as a business model for people to create firearms outside of traceability and provide firearms to a criminal business network?
Thank you. Thank you, Senator, for that question. Yeah, this is a business opportunity. You heard earlier from the Attorney General about the markup involved in these firearms, and that's because they are particularly appealing on the street. But let's take a step back. If you are seeking—
Because of their anonymizing characteristics.
Exactly. Because they're unserialized, because there's no history associated with them. When you acquire a gun illegally through an underground network, you don't know where that gun has been or what crimes are associated with that gun through ballistics or otherwise. But with
Can I
ghost guns,
explore that with you just a minute?
Sure.
With you and I guess Attorney General Shapiro as well. I served in law enforcement as our state's Attorney General. We had full criminal jurisdiction in Rhode Island, like Delaware and Alaska. I was the U.S. Attorney. I've done some work in this space. And one of the things that was very helpful in investigating gun crimes is the traceability of the weapon, either a gun that's left behind or discarded unsuccessfully at a crime scene that you can trace back to, in some cases, even the original dealer who sold it, which then gives you evidence to work forward and try to figure out who was at the crime scene, or ballistics, whether the projectile itself or the brass after it had been discharged by the firearm leaves marks that can be traced and cross-referenced. To me, that's a very important part of criminal investigation where shootings and murders have taken place. And to me, the families of people who've been killed are really owed that law enforcement use all these tools at its disposal to understand as clearly as possible who's behind these types of shooting crimes. How do ghost guns figure into that regime of evidence collection, analysis, review, and traceability that helps get to the bottom of fatal crimes?
Well, Senator, they don't fit into it. If you go and shoot someone with one of these ghost guns, You're not going to learn anything about the history of that crime gun from the E-Trace system, which is, I believe, what you were referring to, because it's not in there. It's unserialized. In fact, under state law here in Pennsylvania, I'm required by law to track all crime guns and to trace them. And indeed, we are unable to do that with ghost guns because they are unserialized. That's the issue, that we are not able to do that traditional law enforcement work that you did during your time as Attorney General, that General Nerona
And
does
just
now.
to be clear, you do that in order to solve crimes and help victims, not to create some kind of weird national registry or
Of course.
database, right?
Of course. We've had serial numbers on guns for quite some time. We don't have a registry. I'm not advocating for a registry. What I'm advocating for is crime victims. I'm advocating for safer communities. I'm advocating for keeping guns out of the hands of criminals. And to simply require a background check and the serialization of these guns will go a long way to doing that.
Thanks, Attorney General. And Chairman, thank you. Terrific hearing. Well done.
Thank you very much, Senator Whitehouse. Really appreciate your joining us. We have time for additional questions. I don't know whether there are other Republican members who want to participate remotely. Apparently not. I'll begin another round of questions. Let me begin where Senator Whitehouse finished. Mr. Suplina, you have been dealing with ghost guns and focusing on them for a long time. And I've been struggling with this idea that somehow putting serial numbers on them would lead to a national registry of guns for law-abiding citizens. Is there anything different about putting serial numbers on these guns that are homemade and sold by manufacturers or sold in gun shows that's any different from the system we have now for lawfully sold firearms?
No, Senator. And the regulations that have been proposed are just treating these ghost guns the same way we treat all other firearms.
So this concocted fear of a national registry seems like some kind of smokescreen, is it not?
That's correct. And serialization has been required on commercially sold firearms since at least 1968, and this would just apply that same rule to homemade firearms.
And as Attorney General Shapiro and Commissioner Harrison have testified very cogently, law enforcement needs those serial numbers when guns are discovered at the crime scene in order to figure out who used them. And even if they are stolen or lost, the gun still can be traced to the previous owner, and that previous owner can be questioned, correct?
That's correct. It's a very important piece of evidence in solving any gun crime.
Attorney General Shapiro, I think just very recently you apprehended suspects, I'll call them suspects, alleged criminals who were using ghost guns. Could you describe that incident?
Senator, Mr. Chairman, there have been so many incidents of this. I'm not exactly sure which one you're referring to. We had one about a week and a half or so ago where we had very serious meth dealers in the Lehigh Valley who had $1 million worth of meth, which, for the record, is a lot of meth. They also had ghost guns on them and Nazi paraphernalia. These were serious criminals in our communities, and in order to foster their illegal drug trade, they were relying on ghost guns because it was the only guns they could get their hands on because of their criminal background.
These ghost guns are not only these kinds of handguns, but often they are AK-47s.
That's correct.
Correct?
That's correct, sir.
In fact, I recently saw an ad online for one of them. The seller of an AK-47 build kit announced that it was, quote, one of the simplest processes to date, end quote. The seller helpfully provides a video help assemble it. Another seller boasts that with their AR-15 kit, quote, building time doesn't take too long. Within an hour or so, you should be breaking it in at the range, end quote. Have you seen these kinds of ads and sales?
We've seen these ads, we've seen these sales, and we've seen these guns on the street. I would just point out something that I think should hopefully be an obvious fact, but criminals oftentimes are weary of buying these online. I think, Mr. Chairman, you referred to an online advertisement that you saw. Why are they weary of doing that? Because it requires some sort of payment that you could then, in law enforcement, potentially trace back. More often than not, we're seeing the criminals at the gun shows, whether they're buying the AK style or they're buying this style, purchase these ghost guns with cash and then use them for criminal activity, oftentimes the same day.
And the cash can't be traced either.
That's correct.
Commissioner Harrison, how do the men and women in your police force feel about these ghost guns?
Well, just like I feel about it, just like the chiefs across America, the men and women in rank and file of my department and many departments are concerned that because this is becoming the weapon of choice, it's going to make our job that much more difficult to hold people accountable. Just recently, the latter part of last year, our warrant apprehension task force executed a search and seizure warrant for a subject who had committed a non-fatal shooting. In there, we found a bunch of firearms, but 8 of them were ghost guns, or these privately made firearms. And we were unable to determine how he acquired them, where he acquired them from, who would have sold them or given them to him. Now, while we can do ballistics checks to tie them to other shootings, perhaps it is unknown to us how we hold people accountable who would have bought these guns, or even if he bought them for the purpose of selling them and putting them into the hands of other people. And what we're seeing is a large number of people under the age of 21 who are not allowed to purchase or carry a firearm now in possession of these ghost guns. So the men and women of my department, and as a leader in a number of policing agencies, talking to chiefs every week and every day, we're all very concerned that more and more people who should not have them are getting them, and more young people who otherwise would not be able to get them are getting them, and they're untraceable, and crimes are going either uninvestigated or unsolved.
Thank you. Mr. Suplina, you mentioned in response to one of Senator Whitehouse's questions that the motive of the manufacturers of these ghost guns is hardly to promote the Second Amendment rights of people buying them. They're making these ghost guns because they're making money, correct?
This has become a very big business, yes, Senator.
It's a big business. It's growing and becoming more and more profitable, correct?
That's correct. We've identified, in fact, just last year, we identified 80 online sellers of ghost guns. That number's up to 100 this year. And the marketplace has not only grown in number, but it's grown in boldness too, right? You've seen now not just the receivers and frames, but full kits. You've seen the quotes that you mentioned. It's ridiculously easy to build. Anybody can do it. And we've seen those manufacturers appealing to the fact that these are, in fact, untraceable ghost guns.
So in their ads, in their sales pitches, they explicitly pitch that they're untraceable because they have no serial numbers.
That's correct, Senator.
That's one of their major selling points.
Right.
Yes, sir.
And why it's becoming a bigger and bigger business. Did you say more than 100 manufacturers are now?
More than 100 sellers online, yes.
Let me just close by saying, well, let me ask the ranking member whether he has any more questions. I would just close by, first of all, thanking all of you for being here today. What we're seeing in the surge and even explosion in the number of sales of these homemade weapons is absolutely stunning. I think it creates truly a threat not only to legitimate law enforcement, but really to any kind of gun safety protection, because it creates the ability to create a kind of fully visible black market. Mm-hmm. Guns sold to criminals in plain sight. Mm-hmm. No checks, no background verification, nothing. And that's the reason that President Biden has acted to stop them, and why law enforcement is so strongly in favor of this new regulation. Your testimony has been very powerful. I thank all of the witnesses for being here today, and unless the witnesses have anything to add, I'll close the hearing. Senator Lee.
Ms. Hlebinsky, can you tell us why Congress in 1968 decided not to serialize homemade guns?
Well, there's a couple of reasons that appear in a lot of these things, but it's important to state that a lot of the Gun Control Act was actually to stop importation of the firearms that were called Saturday Night Specials from coming into the United States. And it's important to note with this that a lot of that were striker-fired technology that had been around for a really long time. So serialization is not a be-all to end-all in terms of tracking a firearm. They were originally used as more of an assembly number on the firearm. Antiques that also include striker-fire guns, semi-automatics. These things all made before 1898, which was also added on during the Gun Control Act of 1968, can be fully functional firearms that are a lot of the terms that we talk about today as a concern for technology. These things as well are things that aren't necessarily traceable, because an antique, which again can be a semi-automatic, can be a striker fire, can have what's called a high-capacity magazine, these things are also not legally firearms.
Now, there's been some talk about the National Gun Registry, and we've had some people say that they don't subjectively intend to create a National Gun Registry with this regulatory change or otherwise. But that's not really the concern, is it? Doesn't it relate to where it might naturally lead?
Well, there are, concerns with serial numbers and the kind of forms that you fill out with the background checks. But ultimately, the serial number question it's interesting, because the ATF is talking about in their latest proposal where to put a serial number on some of these things. And it's unclear where they think that that is important. And so a lot of issues coming in with serial numbers on these 80% firearms, because 100% do have serial numbers and do undergo the background checks. A lot of this conversation is where you put it, where the most important thing is, and it makes it just incredibly confusing. And as the ATF is discussing, and if you read their definition, it doesn't really provide any clarity on where and why it's important. And additionally, the new definitions are so ambiguous that they could include a lot of different things, and they are putting the power into the director of the ATF rather than Congress overall for how to determine whether or not you need to put a serial number on, and whether or not these things are considered quickly assembled, or if there's filing and other processes that are used and made to, in fact, make a gun functional. Just because a firearm can be assembled does not mean it is functional. And if I may really quick touch on the conversation about ads and sales. And this is something that I don't typically, as a historian, use in order to understand reality. If Hiram Percy Maxim hadn't called his gun a silencer in his patent, in his marketing, we may not have as much regulation of silencers, similar to Europe, where in a lot of places you can buy them over the counter. But he used the term silencer because it was impactful to the marketing, even though it's not true. So a lot of things get marketed even though they are not true.
The fact that they're marketed that way shouldn't impact their legal classification or diminish the liberty of those who utilize those products.
Correct. Marketing slogans are used to sell products, but it does not mean that that is how they function. It does not mean that that is reality. And it's a question of whether or not the consumer can look through a marketing slogan and see and have autonomy in their own right to do the research and know what's reality and what's a product to sell.
Mr. Vasquez, in the minute I've got remaining, do you want to add anything to what Ms. Hlebinsky said and what you've commented already today with regard to the risk of the creation of a national gun registry?
I would like to talk about the gun registry and tracing real quick. If you look at how it's speculated that homemade firearms will be serialized by this new rule, it is very close to making a gun registry. Now, as far as tracing is not the end-all cure-all. Tracing a firearm will take you to the last commercial purchase, period. Majority of the firearms in commerce today are used guns or deliberately purchased as straw purchases. So those firearms, you know right then and there that it was a straw purchase, or this gun may have been sold 2 or 3 different times and entered in commerce. I have personally brought back disc loads of thousands of firearms from Central America where we entered them to the tracing database to attempt to do trafficking schemes. All of these firearms were entered and we had no source. They were never completed trace. And along with that, we keep talking about a gun without a serial number. How many of these firearms that are collected had the serial number ground off? That has not been discussed. So I know the tracing is not a cure-all, end-all. Garbage in, garbage out is a magic term for the tracing data. And tracing data can be skewed by anybody in the manner that they request the data. So when we talk about tracing a firearm, the serial number is not going to guarantee that you can trace that firearm.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Hlebinsky, I'm going to give you an opportunity to clarify, as a historian, a little bit of what you've said. You're aware that the current background check system was adopted in the early 1990s, I think 1993, correct?
Correct.
Has it led to this massive national registration system?
Not currently.
And I think Senator Lee asked you earlier about 112,000 NICS denials, correct?
120,000, and that was specifically referencing straw purchases, yeah.
Are you sure that it was straw purchases or simply NICS denials?
I believe, according to the government agency, which I can't remember the name of it right now, that it was straw purchases, but I'd have to check.
Yeah, I think you should check, because I think you're referring to the number of denials, not necessarily the number of straw purchases, but we can check. And finally, are you a supporter of the background check system?
As a historian, I can analyze.
As a citizen.
Well, I don't really talk about my personal feelings because my job as a historian is to analyze it one way or the other. So I don't speak publicly on whether or not I support them, but I can speak publicly on the things that are on that background check form and when and how they're being used.
Are you aware that some 90 or 95% of the American people favor universal background check?
The universal background check, which is not being discussed today, but it's an interesting conversation because it gets back to the conversation of ghost guns and terminology that people feel like they can get behind without fully understanding the ramifications of that. And as I understand, which this gets a little bit into areas that are not necessarily historical, but there are issues within the way that the background check form is searched in terms of the lack of serial or the lack of social security number that is not required. And so before considering expanding universal background checks, you need to look, and like I said before with this, internally at the laws, how they're phrased. Are they working as they are? Are we enforcing those things before trying to make it bigger and grander and really put a burden on a lot of people that have to do that and may cause down the road an issue of can we keep up with that and are we actually accomplishing what we're trying to?
Let me just conclude by asking the three or two law enforcement officials who are here. Attorney General Shapiro, would putting serial numbers on ghost guns, in other words, eliminating ghost guns, help save lives?
Without a doubt. We see them cutting down lives every single day. We're here asking the United States Senate for action. I've heard from the acting ranking member and others, critique of the ATF and their actions. I've heard critiques of the Biden administration. The surest way to deal with that is for Congress to actually do something and pass a law that's going to really have an impact on saving lives. And one of the best ways that this body could act to help us save lives is to have background checks on these ghost guns. That will save lives in Pennsylvania, and I would suggest across the country as well.
Thank you. Commissioner Harrison, will putting serial numbers on ghost guns help save lives?
I think the chiefs across America and law enforcement executives, probably most, if not all, join me in saying yes to that, because we can absolutely hold people accountable for illegally buying them and then illegally selling them and passing them on to people who should not have them or otherwise would not be able to get them. We absolutely believe it would save lives.
Mr. Suplina, based on your extensive experience with ghost guns, do you think putting serial numbers on them would help save lives?
Yes, Senator, I do. And as Senator Cruz said earlier, strengthening the NICS system is an important way of keeping the public safe. If you believe that the background check system can help save lives, then you have to believe that regulating ghost guns will save lives.
Thank you. This hearing record will remain open for a week. We may have some written questions for you, and we'll send them to you if we do. Thank you very, very much to all our witnesses and to my colleagues for joining us. The hearing is closed.
Thank you.
That was excellent.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you so
really
much.
Appreciate
well
it.
done.
Thank you, Senator, so much.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
However we can help, please.
Yeah. Well, you helped a lot today. So
I can't believe what you're up against every day. It's stunning, the level of ignorance.
well, you asked which job I prefer.
Yeah. Thank you for all your work on this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good to meet you guys.
Unless I have any follow-up or anything else.
Thank you so much.
We do have to support you.
I